This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. For the last 18 months, everyone has been touched by a global pandemic. I'm very fortunate today to have onto my podcast the 7th Nobel Prize winner to appear. The first Nobel Prize winner to appear on this podcast who won his prize in biology. My guest today is the renowned biologist Paul Nurse, and he has spent his career revealing how living cells work. His new book, What is Life? He takes up that challenge of describing what it means to be alive in a way that all of us can understand. This is one of those conversations that I live for. I did not expect to have such a great conversation. I mean, Paul's a Nobel Prize winner. That means he's probably got a lot of good stuff going on. But this was a super fun conversation with a super smart guy. Look, we all know today that biology and science, in many ways, has become politicized. I've got my political point of view. Paul has his political point of view. But guess what? His book is not politics. His book is biology. And this global pandemic that we're all living in, it's about biology. Now, behind the scenes, maybe there's some politics about how it happened. And all that's great. But our conversation today is about biology. Let's take us all back in time. Go back to that high school or college biology class. Then bring it forward up to speed to COVID time. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation today with Paul Nurse. You go, I assume you're in Uganda, you're in the rainforest, you're going to study the gorillas, you're up close and personal, but there's got to be a feeling, that moment when you, one form of primate, makes eye contact with another form of primate in their natural habitat. That has got to be an amazing feeling.
In thinking about how we are related to everything else in the world, every living thing on the planet, I had a really striking experience when I was trekking in the Ugandan mountain rainforest with a guide looking for gorillas. We came across a family of gorillas, in fact, quite a big one. I think in the end, maybe as many as 28. And the guide was pointing at some of them in the trees. I wandered a little bit off. And then suddenly I was facing a massive silverback gorilla. And he was sitting on the ground looking at me. And I crouched down and was staring into his eyes. He looked at me, deep brown eyes. And I remember he put his arm out and he took hold of a little tree next to him, maybe 3 inches in diameter, maybe a little more. And with one arm just pulled it down so it was now no longer vertical, but horizontal. And I got a sense that he was trying to tell me something, that maybe he was just a little bit stronger than I was. And he stared at me and then he let it release, bing. Then he ambled over to my tree, right close, and climbed up the tree. And do you know what happened next? He urinated all over me, just putting me, I think, into my place. Now, it was actually quite a moving experience, although I could have done without pee, I have to say. It was a very interesting experience because looking at this gorilla, you just knew you were related. You sensed he knew we were related. His eyes, so deep, so thoughtful looking, staring at me. It was so clear that in some sense, we were both related and we both knew it.
I cannot profess to being a gorilla expert, but one thing, and I'm going to paraphrase this, that I think I know, is that gorillas can be sedentary. They can sit for a long time, and they still will have, if they need it on a moment's call, the muscular strength, the quickness, the movability. Whereas us humans, us Homo sapiens, if we sit around, we kind of start to degenerate. I mean, it's really interesting, right? I mean, it's quite a comparison. They kind of look like they're lounging around and oafing, but on a moment's notice, it's like, wow, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am.
Well, the guide certainly said these animals can really move fast if they want to. What was striking for me is he didn't move fast. He walked very slowly close to me. And again, I sense he didn't want to frighten me. He just wanted me to be aware he was there and maybe I should be careful of him. But he didn't really want to threaten me.
It would be interesting to know if we could ask him if he knows his physical prowess is greater than yours just because he can eye you up, or has he had prior experience? How does he know he's that much better? It's probably pretty obvious, but it's an interesting question.
Well, it is, but let's be quite honest about it. I'm little, short, wimpish, and a bit fat. So I think there was absolutely no competition there in terms of physical prowess. It also should be said that these troops of gorillas were used to human beings. They were wild, of course, but they were in a reserve that was protected. The human beings they saw did not harm them, and they were conditioned to them. So it made it easier to interact with them.
Did you have any sense of the pulse quickening or the heart rate jumping up a little?
It was hot and humid, and I was sweating profusely. It wasn't simply because it was hot and humid. There were other reasons too.
Oh, I tell you what, it's such a fun place to start. We're not going to stay there for but a minute, but I think it's such an amazing experience. And I hope at some point in my lifetime to go have something similar. I just can't imagine. It must, on a certain level, even a guy like you that is in the middle of biology your entire life, to have that experience. You can't read about that in a book.
Well, you can read about it in a book because I wrote about it in a book. But what you, of course, mean is that you need the experience to really know what it was like. And I did want to communicate it, largely just to introduce the notion that we are all part of a tree of life. We all have some commonalities and connections. It's a reason to respect the entire biosphere and all the animal and plant and fungal life that inhabits it. They're all, in a sense, our relatives, which is a point I made as well.
You share your story in your book about the butterfly as your start. I know 6 or 7 years old, perhaps. I think I was maybe 11 or 12, and my uncle in Southern Virginia took me out on a canoe along the James River. Very steep cliffs. We probably weren't supposed to be doing what we were doing. I think there's very expensive houses at the top of the cliffs. But anyways, we were kind of rambling around because he had found a megalodon tooth. We just started poking around on these cliffs like 5-6 meters up. Lo and behold, we found, 10 vertebrae that kept reducing down in size, starting with the size of a basketball. I don't know if it was a shark or a whale or whatnot. It was really an amazing time to be Mr. Archaeologist right then and there pulling them out. The sad story is my uncle in his infinite wisdom decided that he wanted to leave these outside in his home to be displayed. 25 years later, they're now like balsa wood. They lost all of that great fossil, so.
Well, fossils are great, aren't they? In England, I'm speaking from London here. In England, we have a part of the coast in the southern part of England, which is called Jurassic Coast, because it is a brilliant 10, 20 miles of coastline for finding fossils from the Jurassic and closely located geological time period. It was where some of the very, very first fossils were discovered, or 1800s, including this fish dinosaur, the ichthyosaur, for example. You just wander down the beach. I'm a scientist. I take my lab away on a retreat and we go down there. When we're not working, we go along the beach and just pick up fossils, the ammonites and all other life forms of that type. It's just wonderful, isn't it? You look at these objects and they're hundreds of millions of years old, and we are looking back at life 200 million years ago. Amazing, absolutely amazing.
Years back, I had the paleontologist Jack Horner on this podcast, and he was the inspiration for the Jurassic films. Let you put your thinking cap on and get a little theoretical. You got a Nobel Prize, you're a biologist, you know a little bit more than some of us mere mortals. And I'm not being facetious, But will we ever reach a point in time, Paul, where we can do what happened in the movies? Because I want to go get my Starbucks coffee, having to dodge velociraptors. That would make my life whole.
Well, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? Trouble is, it requires DNA to survive chemically. If you want that sort of dinosaur, at least 65 million years, because that's when dinosaurs went extinct. DNA doesn't last that long, I'm afraid. It lasts longer, it has to be said, as we saw. You can still get partially intact pieces of DNA out of, for example, horses that died 1 million years ago in the permafrost, where it's been very cold. And you can sequence those. You can sequence, of course, other hominids like Neanderthal man, which are hundreds of millions of years old. But the oldest one so far is about 1 million years. Going back much further, and DNA is too unstable for us to actually get anything back. We might be able to go back to your original suggestion, we might be able not to meet the dinosaurs running around, but we could conceive of constructing something that just might possibly live from 1 million years ago. I could conceive of that. We have no way of doing it yet, but that might be possible. But 65 million years, I think, is a bridge or two too far.
Okay, I will not cry on this podcast. I will save my tears. Okay, let's bring it up to something past all of my fun subjects that are most important to me. I think I would be amiss if I did not jump into some of the issues that I think you'll have some perspective on that most of the world is dealing with right now. COVID is an amazing subject. It's brought most people into trying to understand the science. Now, they might be understanding that science through memes, through Facebook posts, through white papers, through people like yourself, through the wrong sources. I think people are genuinely curious. They really want to wrap their arms around where we are. What happened? What do you think happened initially?
Oh, dear. First of all, let me comment on the point you were making that there's a lot of interest now for many people around the world about science, about what viruses are, about how we can combat them, how we can deal with them. I mean, I've never known a period before in my life where you can expect to find something on the news almost every day that is related to COVID, viruses, vaccines, therapies, the immune system. And it's almost endless. Of course, it's extremely important for us all, and therefore it constantly keeps coming up. But it has pushed science to a high point in the agenda and has also introduced interesting thoughts about how we can interact most successfully between specialist scientists and our political leadership, which I think is another very interesting thing that's emerged from here, because we live in an increasingly technocratic and complicated world. We will have to deal with complex issues that are often influenced by science. And do we have the right interactions, the right ways of working that will allow us to come to sensible political decisions? Now, to the question you asked, though, which was something different, how did it all start? No expert in this area, but from what we know about the origins of new viral pathogens attack human beings, they usually are found to have jumped from another animal of some sort into humans because they've changed in some way their structure of the proteins that surround them, which influence what cells, in this case it would be human cells, they can enter. Usually for this type of virus, they come, for some reason that I have no idea why, come from bats, and they normally go through some intermediate. And that is the usual explanation people would think of for this particular one that we are all suffering from. We don't know enough about the initial infection and how it came about, but that's what most scientists think. Of course, I know there's other theories, conspiracy theories. There's also the possibilities that it escaped from a laboratory. It's not completely ruled out. It's possible that something like that happened, but it is probably far less likely than some sort of natural jump from another living thing.
You mentioned the word politics. I find it interesting to go through your background. So, okay, you have a clear political persuasion where you sit, but I've been through your book, and your book is not a political treatise. Your book is biology. I don't think there's anybody on the planet, unless they just want to be slightly off center, there's nobody on the planet that can go through your book and walk away without learning something, and it's not political. But I think you do bring up the politics in the sense that right now, in this moment in time, unfortunately, there's not enough Pauls on the TV speaking non-politically about this. What we have, at least in my estimation, is the politics ahead of everything, the politics ahead of the biology, a politics ahead of the science, the politicians just saying, trust us. Well, trust us and trust the science. But the scientific method is not about trust. It's about being a skeptic. It's about digging in and finding out. Give me your perspective. I have a sneaky suspicion it's a little bit in the same direction I just outlined.
It is. I mean, if I'm asked to talk on radio or TV, I'm asked to talk there as a scientist. I'm not there to talk about my political leanings or whatever. Obviously, these things do influence a bit how you view life, but I'm there to talk as a scientist. That's why when I write about it, you would not immediately say, oh, this guy's following a particular political position or not. I work with politicians and political leaderships of all colors, and they speak to me and interact with me because I'm a scientist. So that's clear. Now, the interaction between scientists and politicians and the public is a really, really important one, as I was hinting at just a few minutes ago, because think about our society. It is really completely, it's getting more and more complex, built on technologies that are built on science that challenges often well-established and long-established beliefs that humans have had over sometimes centuries. Science comes up with things that are a bit challenging about that. That means when we look forward to be able to come to sensible political decisions about things like this pandemic, we do have to work well with the experts, in this case, the scientists, who, as you again hinted, do not always know what the answers are, because there's a lot of skepticism. We don't know what happened. We don't quite know what this virus is going to behave like. We don't know what therapies might work. We don't know how it spreads. A lot of unknowns. Now, I've thought a lot about this because, and I think part of the problem is this: when we learn science in school, we're taught science as if it's stuff that is chiseled in granite on a stone somewhere, and an unchanging truth. That is understandable, because what do we learn at school? We learn things like Newton's laws of motion, formulated about 1700, tested 1,000, 1,000,000 times over, and they work. We know that this is a good basis. And therefore, we give the idea to the public that science and scientists talk with the words of God almost. They understand everything like Newton's laws of physics, and it crosses everything that they do. They don't realize the confused fog in which scientists like me work when we're trying to understand something which we simply don't know enough about. So when this virus popped up, we virtually knew nothing about it. We didn't know where it came from, as we've already discussed. We didn't know who it would infect. We didn't know what people would be damaged and in what sorts of ways. And yet, the politicians and the public wanted instant answers. When we go on to the radio or television, scientists saying, well, we don't know this, we don't know that, it's not really what the politicians want to hear. They want to say, tell us this, and then we want nice, simple sentences to explain to everybody what's happening and what they should do. Now, it isn't like that. It just really isn't like that. There's a concept I often use of science when you're doing research, like I do. It's really a lot to do with what I call tentative knowledge. It's tentative in the sense you don't really know whether it's right. You have an idea, you test that idea. Sometimes you throw the idea away, sometimes you modify it, sometimes it survives. And over repeated testing, it gets more and more secure. Now, that sort of dynamic view of science and knowledge is not one we communicate at school. And so the public and the politicians think we know all the answers straight away. So there is a real communication issue here about what science can do and what science can't do. Now, there's an added feature to this, and that is where there is ignorance or tentative knowledge, there is also a vacuum. And that vacuum can be occupied by those who know nothing at all about anything. And that is, I'm afraid, some of our political leaders. And they can then pronounce almost anything, like maybe we should think about drinking disinfectant because that might help counter a virus. You may have known of one very famous politician a year ago was saying exactly that. And it allows this sort of nonsense to perpetuate. And then it's picked up by social media and amplified by those who are still pretty ignorant about what's going on. And we have to really, in my view, challenge how we discuss these issues and how we come to decisions and how our politics and our political systems can generate good ways of actually dealing with it. And I would suggest this is one of the major challenges that has yet to be fully appreciated from the pandemic. But when we get through it, as I'm sure we will, we need to think how we can handle these situations better than we have done in this particular time with this particular pandemic.
Paul, do you think it's rational for the average person who's been living through this, and I've been in Asia the entire time, but the average person who's been living through this, having some experience, and I think most everybody, well, at least, I mean, I do, but I think a lot of people know somebody who's died of COVID. But given where we are now, approaching 2 years from when it was first announced in China, but given where we are right now with multiple variants popping up, seemingly a new variant that I have to know the name about every day, or not every day, it's a little bit an exaggeration, but a lot. And the fact that we have many different types of vaccines from many different types of manufacturers, is it rational for the average person, given 2 years of this, given the multiple variants and given so many different types of vaccines and a lot of people without access to a vaccine yet, is it rational to just be skeptical of everything?
No, it's not rational to be skeptical of everything. It's understandable that people get skeptical, and it's understandable they get a bit depressed about it. And it's understandable that they think, oh, let's not bother, let's go on. But there will be consequences if you do that. What I think is this: we will only solve this problem when the world is largely vaccinated. That's the bottom line. Why it's critical is where we get these variants arising, it's a consequence of evolution by natural selection, essentially. If you have a large viral load across the world because many people are infected, even though you may have vaccines that actually reduce the symptoms that you have, if the virus is still there and still copying itself, then that provides conditions when new variants will arise. New variants will actually not, by the very nature of what's happening, not be countered necessarily efficiently by the vaccine that somebody may have. Until we can get the vaccine out there and to stop variants arising because a viral load is reduced, it's always going to be a problem. We need to vaccinate the world. We need to use vaccines that are effective. And we know that some vaccines are really working. And thank goodness they are, by the way, because what would we have done if it had been like AIDS, for example, where it's been extremely difficult to get vaccines? We would be in big shit. Let's be perfectly blunt about it. There will be variants. You can't remember them, but at least we'll get to the end of the Greek alphabet. Then there'll be something else that we can call them. But the way to control variants is basically to get as many people vaccinated in the world so that actually the amount of virus spread through the world is reduced. And that's what we need to aim for.
It's a challenge because I think people, like you said, people are feeling down and depressed, and this is dragging on. I'm in a country that probably only has so far maybe 1 or 2% vaccination across the board, 100 million people. So that's not much at all. Look at countries like India, Myanmar, Indonesia, billions of people, literally. If we can't get vaccinated quickly, the variants keep popping up. When is the end here? You're saying the whole world needs to get vaccinated to stop this, but we've got a lot of people that are not for all kinds of reasons, and we keep getting the new variants. So map out how this can end. I'm sure you've thought about it.
Well, first of all, I'm no expert on it, but the vaccines do provide a way forward. Some of the vaccines, like the Oxford AstraZeneca one, is not that expensive. It may be $3 a shot, for example. Some of the more sophisticated ones are 10 times that price. But we have vaccines that could be afforded by the entire world. It's one of these situations where the entire world has got to work together. We do see that in other great problems that we face, like climate change, for example, where the world has got to work together. Now, we're not used to that. We're used to the nation state. We have those of certain political opinions, that don't want to be told what to do. So I don't want to say this is simple, but we have to go beyond the nation state. We have to work as a world together. It is possible to deliver it. Countries like India, they've vaccinated not enough, but several 100 million people. And we have to support the poorer nations, some in Southeast Asia, who have very low vaccination rates, although, of course, some of these countries did rather well, especially early on, because they were used to dealing with these viruses. But it's got to be an international effort. We haven't quite got round to that yet. And there's organizations that need to think about this, the UN, the WHO, of course. We haven't quite got round to it, but that's where we have to go. And then we have to get cheap vaccines out there, and we have to vaccinate as many as possible. We probably have to tolerate, and will have to tolerate, the virus being around for some years, like influenza. But if it's containable, then we can perhaps live with it. But what we cannot allow is large viral loads being tolerated in the planet, because it will give rise to increasing numbers of variants and we lose control. That's the fear, at least I have.
Let me take you back into the heart of your work, your book, and talk a little evolution. And I'll give a question and let you use it as a teaching moment. But one thing that intrigues me, fascinates me, as an amateur dinosaur guy, and watching all the shows and watching the evolution from the fossil record of sauropods, starting off as very small animals and then eventually getting to be the biggest, well, not, I guess the blue whales are bigger, but perhaps the biggest land animals ever, What I'm curious about, though, is your perspective on the evolution of us, where we stand right now, because obviously there's a fossil record. It's not complete, but we're able to piece together, to a large degree, how we got to where we are today. I'm curious your perspective about where we're going. If we had to roll forward 1 million years, what will we look like? Will we still be one tree of Homo sapiens? Will there be one tree that's all the size of Shaquille O'Neal? What will happen to us?
As you know, predicting the future is not a simple thing. I think that was a baseball quote, if I remember correctly.
Yogi Berra, I think, yes.
Yogi Berra, exactly. So I'm with Yogi Berra. Predicting the future, not so easy. What is interesting is that there have been many different human-like species on the planet, quite a lot in the last 1 million years. They've all gone extinct except for Homo sapiens. Some, like Neanderthal, was around up to about 30,000 years ago. We have others which were possibly around even later, we know less about. But now we have one species. Now, you ask, will there be many different variants? I don't think so. And the reason is because we don't have isolation of populations anymore. We have a mass society. It's very global. We interact with everybody. And without that isolation, there will be no speciation. And the reason that speciation can occur, that is divergence, is if you get isolated pockets of population for quite a long time in particular places. I cannot imagine that, even though we no longer have the 747 because they phased out, we have other ones like 787s, for example, which will mix us all up. I don't think we will be all mixed up. We're pretty similar genetically across the entire planet. Sequence people in different places in the world, we have very similar sequences. So I don't think that's going to happen. Another part of your question, which is the one that one can't easily answer, is given that we're all mixed up together, but will we evolve in particular ways? And that is quite difficult to answer, because what are the selective pressures under which we will be operating that could be important? And
using our phone?
Yeah, using our phones, finger agility, exactly. Diet, and how is diet going to change? There have been great and dramatic changes in the way human beings live in the last 10,000 years only, really. Now think about it. 20,000 years ago, lots of small bands of hominids, hunter-gathering, hunting something or collecting nuts or whatever. Then we had the agricultural revolution, changed our diet dramatically. Of course, we have diseases related to that, like diabetes, because our sugar has gone up. Then 5,000, 7,000 years later, urbanization, where infectious disease is going to be spreading very much more rapidly. We're still getting used to those changes that have occurred there. Now, we're going to have changes in the way we live in the coming centuries. So there may be some pressures, and I can't really predict what they might be, that could influence how we are. More interesting, and maybe what the science fiction writers like to write about, is could we extend our capabilities with prosthetic artificial intelligence type components that might increase our ability to do, I'm not quite sure what exactly. Is that possible? Well, yes, of course it's possible, because you could say driving a car is an example of it. I mean, we've extended our ability to travel faster by having a car, and it's not much the same type of thinking. So it's not quite as radical as it might sound. I mean, the way we are living today, we have extended our ability to live. The mere fact that we are talking 7,000 miles apart as if we're in the same room is an example of that. So we have many examples already where we have extended what we are, and that will continue to take place. But I wouldn't say that means a great fundamental change of us turning into some sort of android-like object. It's simply an extension of what we've done already, is I think how I would view it.
I'll be a little random on you today. So many buttons I can press with you. We're unique that we can communicate. You say this at the end of your book. You say, as far as we know, I like how you couch that. As far as we know, we're the ones that have the ability to connect like this. And so it's going to be really interesting. I guess this is another one of these prediction type questions. Be really interesting that if we can find out for sure at some point in time in the future where there is another, if it's an animal, a tree, that there is some other form of communication that we don't know about. That fascinates me.
Well, I think there are different ways of communicating. I mean, plants communicate with each other in ways that we're only just beginning to decipher, really. They communicate with volatiles, releasing chemicals into the atmosphere that can diffuse. They communicate through their roots from different trees start to touch each other. Now, there's a whole communication system going on there that we haven't got to the bottom of. And it's one of the interesting areas of biology, I would say, that we just haven't quite got to the bottom of. Where I thought you were going to go, though, and I was just going to briefly comment on, is when you were developing my sentence, as far as we know, which just shows you what sort of person I am, where I'm hedging my bets all the time, as far as we know, is do I think there will be life which is different to the life we have on this planet, which is another question of the sort that you keep asking me, of these ones that are impossible to answer, of course. But I think that is really, really interesting, and I really don't know the answer to it. And it would be absolutely fascinating to know whether there are other life forms and whether those life forms are built on the same pattern as life we have on our planet, whether it's minor variants of that or just something completely different. Those are interesting questions. Whether ever we will be able to find out is something else. I mean, if there's something in this solar system, we will find out. If it's something in another solar system and it takes light 4 million years to get to us, I think that's much tougher.
But you would not want me to just ask you easy questions. You want to have something that makes you go, oh my gosh, why is he asking me that question? Just give me the softball, right?
Yeah. I've answered everything so far in some fashion.
Here's another one that's interesting and complicated, and you brought up the life extension, so I start to think about the notion of cloning people. I don't think we are there yet, are we?
No, well, it depends quite what you mean by cloning. I mean, of course, identical twins are clones, so that happens naturally, and we shouldn't forget that. Probably what you were thinking of when you said cloning was specifically genetically modifying genes in a developing embryo at the level of an egg so that you produce a directed genetic change for some purpose. And you asked whether we're there or not. There's different steps to this. One is the ability to specifically modify particular genes. Now, we've been able to do that for about 40 years or more in simple organisms. I work with yeast. In 1980, devised ways of doing exactly that, gene editing in yeast, and others working on other simple microbes like yeast managed to do that. But the big breakthrough which extended that work was the CRISPR-Cas. It's a method that allows that type of approach to be used in all living things to modify their DNA, and including ourselves. Okay, so now, whereas before that was impossible, now we could do it. So now we could, in principle, modify the genes in a human being. Routinely, I mean, I sit here at the moment in my institute, the Francis Crick Institute in London, and people are modifying the genes of human cells in tissue culture all the time. I mean, it's now a routine method. But of course, to turn that cell into a human being is a completely different story. And now I'm going to comment on that. The first thing is to use a method which is right 99% of the time is fine if you're just doing experiments. It's absolutely not fine if you're producing modified human beings, if 1% of the time the editing, the change goes somewhere else where you didn't need to direct it, because you will damage somebody at far too high a rate. So that's one thing you've got to be sure of, that the technique you're using is very precise and is completely safe, is not yet completely in place. The second thing is you've got to know enough about the genes and how they work to know what the impact is, what the effect is of modifying a particular gene. Now, in some cases, it's relatively straightforward that you might have the gene that is defective in a disease like cystic fibrosis, where it's a very simple genetically defined disease, which if we can correct it, means that person can live normally. There's not so many diseases of that sort, but there are some. That is something that we could imagine doing, and not only could imagine doing it, but I think most people would probably be ethically okay with it because of the nature of it. That sort of technology is already being used to treat not eggs, which you would need to do if you were to clone, your initial question, but if you had a disease which was a consequence of alterations in a particular gene and you could correct them in part of your tissues or cells or your organ, then that is like a therapy. So again, I don't think people would have too much of a problem with that. I think the problem comes when the disease is complex genetically, and so you don't quite know what to do, or maybe you don't really know what to do at all. You don't know whether you will, if you hit a particular gene, whether that will have consequences that you don't understand, and that could lead to yet more problems that are not understood. It's all made more complicated because although you might be happy treating a disease, would you be happy to use it for more cosmetic purposes, like to make somebody tall or have blue eyes or blonde hair or big feet or more musical or whatever? Then it starts getting a bit uncomfortable, I think. How do we deal with all of this stuff? Which is really, I think, the important point. It goes back to the point I was making before. Technology and science will continue to impinge upon our lives in good ways, but in complex ways. And the only way to deal with it is to identify those issues early on, which are complicated, and have proper discussions about them at an early stage before they overrun you, and come to sensible decisions about how you handle them, whether you should use gene engineering of this sort, cloning, whether you shouldn't, under what circumstances you should. The mistake is to bury your head in the sand, not talk about it, and then suddenly find that all these things are possible and we don't have the ethical and moral discussions that allow us to handle it. That is part of that challenge I was talking about earlier, of getting good discussion between science, technology, or scientists and technologists, political leaders and the public to get satisfactory answers to those questions.
I'm curious about you. I know you have an interesting family background. For everybody out there that wants to say, well, a guy like Paul, he wins the Nobel Prize. He must have a silver spoon, came from perfect situation, all that kind of fun stuff. I don't think that's your case, but I would love for you to kind of give, I know this is asking you to brag a little, but I want you to, because look, people can learn. I want you to kind of share a little bit of the story of you. What drove you? What pushed you? What was the magic that was pulling you along? I mean, the itch you had to scratch that you couldn't stop. And now here you are, you're talking to crazy me in Saigon.
You're referring to the fact, of course, although I'm a geneticist, which is what I am, I wasn't aware of my own genetics. So really, I quite advanced in my life. And when I was nearly 60 years of age, when I was working in the United States, in New York, in fact, I was refused a green card. Quite admired Homeland Security for doing that, I must admit, as I was at the time a Nobel laureate, president of university, and knighted. And so I had quite a lot of sort of Boy Scout badges. And for them to reject me was a sort of rather heroic, I thought. But they did. And they didn't like my birth certificate. They didn't like my birth certificate because it didn't name my parents. I mean, it was a perfectly legal document that just didn't happen to name it. When I did get it, which was been sitting, of course, in the archives in London for years and years, when I did get it, or a copy of it, it revealed that my mother was not my mother. She was my grandmother, and that the person I thought was my sister was actually my mother. This is a story that happens, of course. My real mother got pregnant at 17. She was sent away to her aunt. It's like a 19th century novel. Sent away to my aunt, gave birth to me. My grandmother came up to the town where I was born and pretended to be the mother and came back. And we all lived together with my grandmother pretending to be my mother. My real mother got married, left home. I knew her, of course, but at the time I was growing up, she had her own family and so on. All this was revealed when I was nearly 60 years of age, was a bit of a shock. Highly ironic, of course, that here's me who goes on about genetics all the time, and here's me not knowing my own genetics. It was sort of ironic to the extreme. My background, which is perhaps also what you're referring to, was a rather simple, poor background, really. Working class family, nobody stayed at school after 15 years of age. My grandfather could not really write properly. Yet somehow I was quite good at school, not brilliant, but quite good at school, and stayed on, went to university, blah, 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 and came out the other side as quite a successful scientist. So I did wonder all along why on earth I was different, but I never thought of what was the truth. Now, you asked, what drove me? I have an almost unhealthy curiosity about everything. I'm driven by a curiosity of wanting to know how things work, what's going on at all levels, in all sorts of subjects. I think that is the driving force. Why I have it, I don't know, but it's just wanting to know how things are and how things work. And that's been my driving force, curiosity.
The curiosity for truth.
Yes, it is.
I like to think that most people would be okay with that and would like to have that also, but maybe they're not exposed to it. So was there a reason? Is there an influence? Was there a mentor? Was there a moment that you knew you were on this? You've got the butterfly story that people can read about in the book, but was there a moment, a big moment, that really pushed you down the direction of this search for truth, this curiosity to find out why?
No, I don't think there was. It's more like bricks in the wall, build it up a little bit at a time.
A little Roger Waters?
Well, yeah, something like that. I didn't have a road to Damascus change. I didn't see a flash of lightning and then suddenly all was made clear.
You just kept grinding?
I think I realized I was very curious about the world because I was younger than my brothers and sister, my mother. I was quite often alone at home with my grandparents. And they were grandparents. It wasn't hugely active at life. And I thought a lot. I looked at the world a lot. I bought a little telescope and looked at the stars. I looked at the butterflies, as you can read in the book. I just was fascinated in it all. But I didn't have a eureka moment. It just sort of, I got my children. I've got 2 grown-up daughters now. They used to say, Dad, the trouble is you're just interested in everything. Just stop it. Just stop it. I've just got a pathological curiosity. Don't know when it came, but I've always had it.
We've not figured out a way, as you know, as I know, we've not figured out a way to stop this aging process. However, I think you might agree that when you stay curious, and I like to think of myself as curious, I'm talking to you, I get to learn from you, but when you stay curious, it keeps you young at heart. I mean, I think even people listening to you right now, I think you're over 70, but the way you think, the way you talk, you know what I'm saying? There's something to that curiosity and keeping us fresh, my humble opinion.
Well, it's true. And I've had a very, very, very privileged life, coming from quite humble background. I have been paid all my life to follow that curiosity. Imagine it. I've been paid to do just that. I mean, what a privilege. They could have paid me a quarter of what they pay me, and I'd have still been perfectly happy doing it. I have PhD students here doing research. They're quicker than I am. They know lots of things. Between us, we find solutions. I have low cunning and experience. They have sharpness of mind and enthusiasm. I have enthusiasm too. It does keep me young because I'm working all the time with 20-year-olds, very smart ones too. I think you're right. Perhaps does keep you young.
Cool stuff. I appreciate you coming on today. The book everyone should check out. What is life? Understand biology in 5 steps. I really love some of the issues you brought up at the end. I'm not going to go into them all, but there was another issue you brought up. If someone's, let me see if I was going to phrase this right, certain criminal behaviors that are perhaps, we could find out have something to do with that person's genetics. It really made me think. That was one of those questions where I was like, wow, that is one where the answer is not smooth. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. So I think it's a great read in that sense, that you're going to cause people to pause in this busy, chaotic world where everyone thinks the latest Facebook post and 30-second TikTok video is the key to understanding. So I appreciate you reminding us all that there is a deeper path, a deeper understanding that we can go down. So that's cool stuff. I appreciate it, Paul.
Well, thank you. I wrote a very short book. I wanted to write a book that everybody could read and wouldn't get overawed by it. I go to the bookshop and I'd see all the popular science books. They all seem to be 450, 400 pages long. They all seem to sort of have a lot of words, but not necessarily a lot to say. And what I did here, I didn't think up any really good ideas. I took the really clear ideas and just explained them simply to everybody. I wasn't always trying to look over the horizon, which is what most books do, about the next big discovery. I just wanted to communicate what we really know. It'll be a book that in 30 years would still be more or less correct, I would say.
It's a good foundational basics. I mean, it's something that I've not read that type of work or thought about a lot of those issues since high school biology. It's very accessible and a pretty quick read. So I think people enjoy it.
I hope so. I hope so.
Hey, Paul, is there a place you would like to direct people beyond Amazon to buy the book? What is life? Is there a website you would like to direct people to?
I'm afraid not. I'm a bit ancient and I'm still stuck with paper and print. I struggle with the digital.
I give the compliment praising you on your youth, and then all of a sudden you fall back on the Model T explanation. I see how that works, right? Behind you is gene therapy going on. Who knows what's being done in the lab? But then all of a sudden, but listen, hey, I appreciate you coming on. Really, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation immensely. You're a great interviewer. Thank you for that.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.